Chapter 6, Social Policy to Address the Worst Economic Catastrophe in U.S. History, Understanding the Turn Toward Conservatism and Analyzing Why the Depression Began. Stock prices in the 1920s rose significantly, causing investors to rely on credit for stock purchases. Panic struck stockholders when stock prices started to plunge and they sold their shares. This caused even larger implications. Americans of all social classes were suffering in some way. Malnutrition, starvation, foreclosures, and family disruption were reported heavily. Many families lacked basics such as electricity and heat in their homes. The most common beliefs in regards to what caused the Great Depression are insufficient capital, trickle-down policies, and excessive speculation, along with protective tariffs. Assessing the period of denial, 1929 to 1933. Beginning in 1929, unemployment was high, stock prices were down tremendously, and companies were filing bankruptcy. Because recessions had occurred before, people were hopeful that economic growth was in their near future. President Hoover saw that there was a serious problem, but he did not believe in major government programs, and he believed that private agencies could service those in need. The Emergency Relief and Construction Act of 1932 provided funding for local governments that had gone bankrupt, tracing the emergence of Franklin Roosevelt as a national figure. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected in 1932 as a liberal pragmatist. He was willing to be innovative and try new initiatives to deal with unemployment and to improve the well-being of American citizens. When he was the governor of New York, he provided state funds through an emergency act, and he worked with social workers in doing this. Roosevelt was said to be an infectious optimist, and he was the only president to ever serve 4 terms. Evaluating the era of emergency reforms, 1933 to 1936. When FDR's presidential term began, 20% or more of the population was unemployed. Roosevelt appealed to middle-class families by acknowledging that conservative methods and even traditional political ideas, such as laissez-faire, were not solutions to this crisis. The New Deal was FDR's claim to fame, but labor leaders did not always fully support the movement. They were caught up in trying to organize or create labor unions. Amongst those not in support of the New Deal were the Four Horsemen, the justices who consistently opposed the passage of large-scale social legislation because the power to do this was not written in the Constitution. The U.S. lacked proper institutions to make big reforms, and the ones they did have were quite corrupt. Francis Perkins found that patronage and payoffs were commonplace in government. Hopkins and Aubrey Williams also played a role in this. With FDR's creativity and persuasiveness, he found a way to launch the New Deal and change the federal budget so that more than 50% of the federal budget would fund work relief and relief programs from 1934 to 1939. Under the Roosevelt administration, social workers were hired to enhance professionalism and help advise welfare services. The Federal Emergency Relief Administration provided welfare to the unemployed and helped out the working poor. The Civilian Works Administration was added as a part of FARA in 1933. It gave social welfare roles to federal government and addressed the unemployment of young workers. When this initiative did not pan out, the Work Progress Administration was created. Other acts and movements were addressed, but ultimately they all had the same goal, trying to end the Great Depression itself. The steps taken were increasing federal spending, restoring confidence in banks, attacking speculation in stocks, stopping the job and price cuts in industry and agriculture, and reviving economies in cities across the nation. Identifying pivotal New Deal victories, 1934 to 1936. The Social Security Act committed the federal government to fund OAA, ADC, and AB. This provided support for the elderly, dependent children, and the blind. FDR made a huge change in American history through this act alone. Around this time, unions were given widespread support. The Works Progress Administration and the National Youth Administration continued the rivalry between Ix and Hopkins as they both wanted to head the same agency. The WPA was criticized by liberals and conservatives alike due to its make-work jobs. After this, Roosevelt faced rescinding support from the Supreme Court and wondered if the New Deal programs would all be shut down. However, Roosevelt won the presidential election by a landslide in 1936. Assessing the era of stalemate, 1937 to 1941. The middle class supported Roosevelt and the Democratic Party after the realignment of political parties a few years earlier. Anger of the New Deal was often focused on the advisors of his program, such as Hopkins, because they did not like the power the advisors were given. People started to believe that the New Deal programs were moving towards socialism.
Created using Powtoon.